Beneath the noise of modern life, beneath the pattern of streets and sidewalks we assume are permanent, there are older grids waiting in the dark. They are not distant ruins in faraway deserts. They are not lost temples swallowed by jungles. They are directly under the foundations of cities we walk through every day. The idea sounds impossible until you stand in front of the first examples and realize how calmly they defy explanation. We live our lives on the roof of history. To the modern urbanite, the city is a flat plane of asphalt, glass, and steel. We view the ground as a solid, static foundation. But the deeper we probe into the earth beneath our metropolises, the more we realize that the ground behaves less like stone and more like memory. It is a biological and architectural record that holds its breath until the weight above shifts, until time loosens its grip just enough for a forgotten surface to breathe again. The revelation began on a quiet morning in Rome, a city where history is not a ghost, but a neighbor. During a routine excavation for a new infrastructure project, a team of archaeologists lowered their high-intensity lights into a narrow vertical pit. They had expected the usual, a chaotic jumble of debris, the shattered remains of a collapsed roof, or perhaps the charcoal-stained layers of a long-forgotten fire. Instead, their lights hit a flat grey surface. It was not a ruin, it was a street. 12 meters below the modern traffic, below the rhythmic rumble of Vespers and the cacophony of tourists, a perfectly preserved Roman road stretched out into the darkness. Its basalt stones were smooth, unbroken, and aligned with a precision that seemed impossible after 2,000 years of burial. Dust covered the edges where the road met the subterranean walls, but the center looked almost polished, as if the sandals of legionnaires and the wooden wheels of carts had pressed it down only a few seasons earlier. It was not damaged, it was not eroded, it was simply waiting. The most unsettling aspect for the researchers was the lack of trauma. There was no destruction layer, no layer of ash from a fire, no collapse horizon of fallen marble, no storm deposits or silt from a catastrophic flood. Nothing suggested a violent end. Instead, the road appeared sealed, like a room that had been closed gently and intentionally. The archaeologists whispered amongst themselves. One noted it looked more like an organized abandonment than a ruin. It was as if the city had simply decided to rise, leaving the old world behind without bothering to destroy it first. As they followed the line of the stones deeper into the newly opened chamber, doorways emerged from the shadows. Intact window frames stared back. A fragment of a wall still bore the vivid traces of red cinnabar pigment as bright as the day it was painted. These were not the broken remnants of a collapsed age. These were pieces of a functional city that had been decommissioned and filled with earth. The deeper the lights travelled, the more the scene challenged the standard narrative of history. The street did not end in rubble. It vanished into a packed layer of soil that looked flat, deliberate, and almost architectural. It appeared as if someone had poured the ground itself over the old world with intent, raising the surface to build a new life above. No ancient writer, not Livy, not Tacitus, described such a massive, synchronized elevation project. No tablet or manuscript mentioned a decree to bury the capital, and yet the evidence lay right there beneath their boots. It made the researchers ask a question that felt like a crack in the foundation of their knowledge. If this entire street is intact down here, what else is hidden? If Rome has layers like this, how many other cities hide their own silent levels beneath the present surface? When they finally emerged back into the daylight, the sound of the city above felt different, hollow, almost fragile. It felt as if the modern world were merely a thin shell resting on the sturdy shoulders of an older, more permanent structure. The discovery did not feel like the past rising. It felt like the present was slowly sinking into the depths of time. Before we follow this trail any deeper, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Your messages always remind me how far these mysteries travel and how many quiet rooms they reach. And for those who have been waiting during the quiet months, it means more than you know to walk back into these stories together again. As always, the visuals you see are here to support the narrative, not define it. Thank you for wandering into the unknown with us. Rome opened the door, but it was not alone. The phenomenon repeated itself across the map of Europe. In Paris, deep beneath the polished stones of the Latin Quarter, archaeologists discovered the walls of the Roman settlement of Lutetia. These walls were not mere stumps. They stood several meters high, hidden beneath medieval floors that were themselves buried under later Bourbon-era reconstructions. The layers were clean, distinct, and strangely orderly. In the basements of the 5th arrondissement, one can find Roman masonry that was never knocked down. Instead, the rooms were filled with clean earth, and the foundations of churches were built directly on top. The medieval builders must have stood upon these Roman floors, yet their records are silent about what they found. They treated the buried city not as a curiosity, but as a foundation. Above these churches lie the modern streets, curved and quiet, their inhabitants entirely unaware of the geometry beneath their feet. London holds a similar, perhaps even more complex secret. The modern financial district, with its towering glass skyscrapers, sits directly atop the Roman city of Londinium. When the Crossrail tunnels were carved through the thick London clay, construction crews found entire streets perfectly aligned with the ones above. They found doors that opened into compacted soil, doors that led nowhere, yet remained on their hinges. They found mosaic floors that were perfectly level, exactly where they had been left by people who seemingly walked out one day and never returned. There was no evidence of the Great Fire of 60 AD in these specific strata. Rather, there was evidence of a steady, relentless raising of the ground. Generation after generation preferred to build upward, using the debris and soil of the past as the floor of the future. The City of London did not just expand outward, it climbed upward, leaving its earlier versions behind like the molted shells of a growing organism. Across the continent, Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, reveals an even deeper complexity. Beneath the Ottoman neighbourhoods and the bustling markets are Byzantine cisterns so vast they could swallow entire city blocks. Some of these underground chambers, like the Basilica cistern, feature hundreds of marble columns salvaged from even older pagan temples. For centuries, people lived above these echoing voids, drawing water through holes in their floors without fully understanding the massive engineering marvels they had inherited. Above the cisterns are layers of Byzantine houses, then Crusader-era ruins, then Ottoman mosques. The ground level has risen so significantly that what were once the second stories of ancient villas are now the basements of modern shops. The inhabitants of one era utilised the systems of the last, but as the records faded, the origin of the streets and conduits became a myth. No one knows who first carved the deepest channels that still carry water today. We only know that we are the latest in a long line of occupants. In each of these cities, Rome, Paris, London, Istanbul, the same pattern appears. The ground did not simply sink due to tectonic shifts. The structures did not simply collapse due to age. The surface rose. It rose slowly in some places, perhaps by a few centimetres a century, and quickly in others. But it did so with a quiet consistency that leaves us with more questions than answers. Why do ancient records remain silent about this? If the raising of ground levels was a common, everyday occurrence, a massive elevation project of the human race, why did no one think it worth mentioning? Perhaps it was so obvious to them that it required no explanation. Or perhaps more unsettlingly, the earth itself participates in the burial, reclaiming the structures of man through a process we do not yet fully understand. The consistency is difficult to dismiss. It suggests that something systematic happened across different civilizations and different continents. The burial was often calm, steady, and strangely uniform. It suggests that civilizations do not erase themselves. They quietly climb, stepping on the shoulders of their ancestors to reach for a higher sunlight. This raises the question that haunts every discovery. How many layers can lie beneath any one location before the earliest one becomes unreachable? Our understanding of history depends on the thin slice of ground we can currently access. If we have only dug down 12 meters, what lies at 20? What lies at 30? The cities that reveal their hidden layers do not do so all at once. They reveal themselves in fragments, in a broken stairway in a cellar that leads down into solid earth, in a window that opens onto a wall of dirt, in a road that passes into a hillside as if it were never meant to end. As archaeologists dig deeper, the map of the past changes shape. The flat, linear timeline of school books, where one empire ends and another begins, starts to bend and curve. We realize that civilizations are not isolated events of rise and fall. They are a stack of human presence. We are not the end of history. We are merely the current top layer. Rome opened the first door. Paris widened the perspective. London and Istanbul proved the global scale of the mystery. But none of these prepare us for the next revelation. As we look at the soil beneath our feet, we must accept that the ground is holding on to something for much longer than we ever expected. We are walking on a crust of the present, supported by the architecture of 1 billion forgotten lives. And as the soil continues to reveal these intact, silent worlds, we are forced to wonder, when our time is over and the next layer begins, who will be the ones to lower their lights into the dark and find our streets waiting, perfectly preserved and utterly silent, beneath their feet? The mystery is far larger than a single road in Rome. It is the story of how we build, how we forget, and how the earth remembers. The most striking example lies far from any modern city, on a quiet hill in southeastern Turkey. When researchers first uncovered the stones of an ancient sanctuary there, they expected to find ruin and erosion. Instead, they found something far stranger. The site had been intentionally buried, not by invaders, not by landslides, but by the very people who built it. The pillars were still upright, the carvings still sharp, the floors still smooth. Whoever covered this place did so deliberately, filling every gap with clean packed earth until the entire structure vanished beneath the surface. No one knows why. There are no records explaining the decision. The act itself is the only message they left behind, a message written in soil rather than words. This kind of burial is not unique. Across the Americas, the Maya built new temples over old ones, not by dismantling the earlier structures, but by enclosing them. Layer by layer, generation after generation, entire complexes were swallowed by later construction until the original sanctuaries stood hidden inside vast stone pyramids. Visitors today walk on polished steps without realizing there might be 2 or 3 older staircases sealed within, perfectly preserved. To reach them, archaeologists must cut through walls that were designed to silence the past, not destroy it. In the Andes, the pattern repeats. Some of the most impressive Inca structures sit directly on top of megalithic foundations that clearly belong to a different tradition. The stones below are larger, tighter, impossibly precise. The stones above are smaller, set with mortar, adapted to fit what could not be moved. It is not evidence of collapse. It is evidence of respect or perhaps necessity. The Inca built over something they chose not to remove or could not understand. Even in the Mediterranean, the same motif appears. In certain ancient sites, entire neighborhoods were sealed behind layers of fill that were carefully leveled before new streets were laid. In these places, the fill material is not chaotic rubble. It is sorted, cleaned, and placed with intention. The older rooms remain intact, their walls unbroken, their thresholds untouched. They were not victims of disaster. They were entombed. The reasons remain unclear. Some scholars describe ritual closure. Others imagine threats, perhaps political, perhaps environmental. But the scale of these burials complicates every explanation. Cultures separated by oceans and millennia all performed similar acts. They hid their own structures. They preserved them through concealment. They created layers of silence beneath their cities, not by accident, but by design. The weight of this pattern forces a new question. If ancient builders intentionally buried their own past, how many layers of humanity remain hidden simply because the people of the time wanted them to vanish from sight? And if the buried structures are often in such pristine condition, what were they protecting them from? Or perhaps more unsettling, whom were they protecting themselves from? Where intention ends and nature begins is never easy to see, but some sites reveal a boundary so clear that it cannot be ignored. There are layers shaped by human hands, and then there are layers shaped by forces indifferent to human plans. Once we step beyond the deliberate burials, we enter a realm where the earth itself becomes an architect, reshaping landscapes and lifting civilizations into new heights while quietly covering the old ones. If you are ready, we can move deeper into the places where nature does the burying and where the layers grow faster than history can record them. The first signs appear along river plains that have carried silt since long before humans learned to trace their channels. In the Mississippi Valley, researchers studying soil cores found entire layers a meter thick formed within a single flood season. A few months of swollen water was all it took to change the height of the land. When floods returned year after year, the layers rose like pages in a book. If houses or streets had stood there, they would not have been destroyed. They would have been swallowed. The Tigris and Euphrates behaved the same way. Excavations in ancient Mesopotamian cities revealed deep bands of clean, uniform silt lying directly above intact walls. Rooms, staircases, and courtyards reappeared beneath these layers exactly where they had been left. There were no signs of fire, no signs of sudden flight. The buildings were not broken. They were sealed by the same rivers that once fed the fields outside their doors. The slow pulse of the earth had raised the ground while the people living above it continued their daily routines, unaware that they were climbing over the quiet burial of their own past. Nature also buries through dust. In northern China, vast waves of wind-borne soil once moved across the landscape, depositing fine layers that now form some of the thickest sedimentary sequences on the planet. Entire villages have been discovered beneath these levels of loess, their walls still standing, their floors still level. These were not settlements wiped away by disaster. They were simply overtaken by the steady drift of a changing climate. Later generations built new homes above them, unknowingly repeating the same cycle. Ash works with similar silence. When volcanoes erupt, they can spread clouds that settle evenly across hundreds of kilometers. The result is a blanket of fine material that preserves whatever stands beneath. Archaeologists excavating regions far from active volcanic zones often find identical ash layers marking events that shaped landscapes long before written memory. Beneath these layers, cities appear as if paused mid-movement, protected by the very substance that once darkened their skies. But even these examples do not push the boundaries of natural burial as far as the Sahara once did. In the shifting cycles of wet and dry phases, lakes expanded and then retreated, leaving behind shorelines filled with sediment. The deserts that seem eternal now once supported grasslands and herds. As the climate hardened, wind and sand reclaimed entire settlements. The dunes rolled over them without violence, capturing homes, wells, and pathways in silence. Centuries later, travellers reported finding doorways that opened into sand, walls that disappeared into dust, and ancient stones that peaked above the surface only after storms passed. The pattern is global. Nature does not bury selectively. It buries whatever stands in the path of its cycles. Floodplain cities lift themselves to stay dry, only to be covered again. Coastal towns shift inland as water rises. Mountain settlements face landslides and river diversions. Each of these events builds a new surface, and the old one becomes part of the deepening archive below. This might seem like an explanation for everything, a comforting way to frame the layers beneath our feet. But the truth becomes unsettling when researchers compare the depth of natural layers with the precision of human ones. Nature can bury quickly, yes, but the uniformity of many ancient layers suggests something else at work. They are too level, too consistent, too clean. They mimic deliberate burial without the fingerprints of builders. That tension, the seam between what nature buries and what humans choose to hide, becomes clearer when we look at something else entirely. In many places, the layers above the buried cities do not resemble debris or sediment at all. They resemble construction. Streets, foundations, and walls rise directly above structures left intact. It is as if civilizations learned to build over the past the same way nature built over the land, continuing the work of burying worlds without ever acknowledging they were doing it. To understand how this happened, and why so many ancient streets lie untouched beneath later ones, we must look at the layers where the craftsmanship below surpasses the work above, where the quality of the past throws the present into question. And as we move downward, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. In the highlands of Peru, this contradiction is carved into the walls. Visitors who walk through the old streets of Cusco see two distinct styles of stonework. The upper levels, built during the Spanish colonial era, rely on mortar to hold their blocks in place. But the lower courses, the ones still carrying the weight of everything above, are cut with an accuracy that seems to defy the tools of their time. Massive stones meet along edges so tight that the line between them disappears. Some blocks twist and interlock through more angles than a modern machine would comfortably manage. Rainwater does not seep between them. Light does not pass through. They sit as though moulded from a single idea, rather than carved from separate pieces. Further north, the giant foundation stones at Baalbek deliver the same unsettling message. The trilithon blocks, weighing hundreds of tons each, form a platform beneath later Roman construction. The Romans built impressive temples across the region, yet even they chose not to move or reshape the stones beneath. They built upon them instead. The foundation, crafted by unknown hands, is more exact, more immense, and more durable than the refined architecture above it. Time did not erode it. Later civilizations simply could not improve on it. And then there is the quiet endurance of ancient infrastructure. The Cloaca Maxima in Rome, one of the oldest drainage systems in the world, still carries water beneath the modern city. Centuries of rebuilding, expansion, and redesign have not replaced it. Its stone vaults have outlasted the very concept of the empire that created them. Many modern systems, built with far more advanced tools, have not survived half as long. Beneath Istanbul, Byzantine cisterns stretch across the darkness in symmetrical lines. Their ceilings rest on columns that seem placed by mathematicians. Each structure is measured and balanced in ways that show an understanding of water, pressure, and stability that would be considered complex even now. Yet above these cisterns are neighborhoods built with less finesse and far shorter lifespans. The older layer is not only deeper, it is often better. These mismatched layers raise two questions that are difficult to avoid. The first concerns skill. How did earlier builders produce work so refined that later civilizations chose not to replicate it, but simply to rest their own foundations upon it? The second concerns memory. Why did the techniques behind these structures vanish, replaced by methods that are easier, faster, but undeniably less durable? The discrepancy does not imply lost super-civilizations. It suggests something more subtle. Knowledge, especially technical knowledge, can vanish quietly. Techniques passed from hands instead of texts can die when those hands are lost. Trade routes shift. Guilds disappear. Workshops fall silent. And when a skill is not carried forward, its creations remain as stubborn reminders of what once existed and no longer can be reproduced. This pattern echoes around the world. Older structures, deeper layers, earlier phases often display a refinement that later phases lack. Something was preserved in stone, yet forgotten in mind, and that forgetting did not happen once. It happened repeatedly, in different eras and places, as if human knowledge were not a staircase climbing upward, but a tide that rises and recedes, leaving behind pockets of brilliance scattered across the landscape. If the deepest layers are sometimes the strongest, and the techniques behind them are often lost, then the earth does more than preserve architecture. It preserves the evidence of vanished knowledge. But knowledge is not the only thing that disappears. Entire interpretations vanish. Meanings shift. And as we move downward through the layers of the past, we find a world where understanding itself dissolves, leaving us with structures whose purpose has been rewritten by the people who came after. To follow that trail, we have to move into the next layer, where the past and the present collide not in stone, but in memory. As the layers deepen, the stones begin to tell a story that the surviving texts cannot. The physical world remembers what the written world forgets. Skills vanish, techniques dissolve, and entire systems continue to function long after the knowledge that created them has slipped beyond the reach of living memory. It is in these gaps that history becomes distorted, not by intention, but by silence. Civilizations rarely document the ordinary. They write about kings, victories, rituals, storms, and omens. They do not write about how a wall was set or how a drain was carved. When life is stable, the practical fades into the background. Generations pass before anyone thinks to ask where the water comes from or why the foundation stones are shaped the way they are. And by that time, the last person who knew may have already died. This is how knowledge disappears without collapse. A single generation fails to pass on a method, and the next receives only the finished product, not the process that produced it. What remains becomes a kind of inherited mystery. People use the systems but do not understand them. They maintain the structures but cannot recreate them. Over time, the origin becomes legend, and the legend becomes myth. In medieval Europe, travellers walked across roads laid by the Romans without knowing who had built them. The stones seemed eternal. The craftsmanship seemed beyond reach. When aqueducts towered above valleys, some believed they were relics of giants. The scale felt supernatural because the knowledge that once made it ordinary had dissolved into stories. The same transformation occurred in Egypt. Later generations stood before monuments carved with remarkable precision, but wrote about them as sacred works of divine intent rather than feats of engineering. The labour, the planning, the logistics all vanished from record. What survived was reverence. The practical details, the daily realities of building and maintaining such systems, faded until they became invisible. This erosion of understanding is not rare, it is systemic. Written history compresses time. It simplifies transitions. It rarely captures the slow drift of forgetting that can happen even during periods of stability. A city does not need to fall for its knowledge to disappear. It only needs life to move forward without regard for what came before. The most revealing evidence lies in places where older systems continued functioning long after their creators were gone. Wells, tunnels, terraces, and reservoirs remained in use for centuries, even millennia. People drank from channels they could not design. They lived above stones whose purpose they could no longer explain. The continuity of function masked the discontinuity of knowledge. When memory fades this way, interpretation bends. Later cultures assign meaning based on what they can see, not what they can no longer understand. A structure built for water management might be reimagined as a ceremonial basin. A retaining wall might be mistaken for a ritual platform. A functional terrace becomes a sacred symbol. The original intent evaporates, replaced by explanations shaped by the beliefs and limitations of the present. In this way, the loss of memory creates a second burial, The first burial happens in the soil, the second happens in the mind. A structure may survive perfectly beneath the earth, but the understanding of its purpose does not survive in the culture above it. The two layers become separated not by sediment, but by interpretation. And interpretation grows even more distorted when the next layer settles, the one where the meanings assigned by later generations harden into assumptions, and the true purpose of older structures disappears behind a veil of symbolism that has little to do with the original world that produced them. As the memory of how things were built fades, the structures themselves begin to drift into new meanings assigned by those who inherit them. A massive reservoir becomes a sacred lake. A retaining wall becomes an altar. A road, perfectly straight and raised above the floodplain, becomes a processional path for ceremonies that may never have existed. With no record to challenge the new interpretation, each generation reshapes the purpose of the past to match the worldview of the present. This is why so many ancient works appear saturated with symbolism today. When archaeologists first surveyed the vast water basins of Angkor, they assumed they were cosmological models, earthly reflections of the heavens. Only later did engineers recognize signs of water flow, regulation channels, and agricultural expansion on a scale large enough to support a city whose true size had been underestimated for centuries. A functional hydraulic system had been mistaken for ritual architecture. In the Andes, terraces carved with mathematical precision across steep mountainsides were long believed to be ceremonial, perhaps built as offerings or stages for rituals. Yet soil studies showed layers of cultivation that pointed to something far more practical. These terraces prevented erosion, stabilized slopes, and expanded the agricultural capacity of entire valleys. Their endurance was not the result of myth, but of necessity. Even stone circles scattered across Europe suffer the same reinterpretation. Many are assumed to be astronomical observatories or sacred gathering sites. Some may well be, but others align more closely with ancient property divisions, water management systems, or boundary markers. Without written explanations, the line between function and ritual blurs, and the imagination fills the space where memory once lived. Beneath Jerusalem, overlapping structures from different eras have been layered, reused, repurposed, and reinterpreted so many times that the original function of many walls is no longer clear. A chamber carved for storage may be reclassified centuries later as a tomb. A passage once part of a drainage system becomes a sacred tunnel. The city is a tapestry woven from meanings that have shifted with every generation. The pattern repeats itself in places where underground chambers lie sealed until chance reveals them. When workers in modern cities break through floors into forgotten rooms, the first assumption is often ceremonial significance. A chamber with columns becomes a sanctuary. A tunnel becomes a ritual corridor. But when these spaces are fully excavated, they often reveal evidence of far simpler uses: storage, drainage, transport, or defense. Function requires no myth, but myth arises easily when function is obscured. All of this raises a subtle concern. If so much of the ancient world is interpreted through lenses shaped by later cultures, how much of what we believe about the past is fact, and how much is projection? How many structures labeled sacred or ritualistic were simply parts of daily life? How many decisions attributed to faith were rooted in engineering? The deeper we travel, the clearer the pattern becomes. The older the layer, the more likely it is to be interpreted through guesswork rather than knowledge. The meanings we assign today say as much about us as they do about the people who built the works we try to decipher. And this misunderstanding does not stop at the surface. When cities rise on top of earlier ones, misinterpretation becomes embedded into the architecture itself. New foundations are laid directly above old ones. Streets shift upward, covering entire districts that are still intact beneath. Out of sight, the older world becomes unfamiliar. Out of context, it becomes mysterious. As we move downward through the layers of buried memory and shifting interpretation, a more physical truth begins to emerge. Cities do not simply forget their foundations. They climb above them. They rise, not by destroying what came before, but by placing new streets, new homes, and new lives directly on top of the old ones. And when they do, the earlier layers remain almost perfectly preserved, sealed beneath the weight of the generations that followed. Some of the clearest evidence comes from places that experienced abrupt transformation in recent centuries, where memory has not had time to dissolve and the reasons for burial are still recorded. These cases reveal how easily the surface can change and how quietly the deeper layers can become invisible. In Mexico City, the Great Cathedral stands above the remains of the Aztec capital. Visitors walk across the plaza without realizing that beneath the stones lie temples, walls, and ceremonial platforms still locked in their original configurations. When the Spanish arrived, they did not erase the city beneath. They built over it, compressing it under new structures and streets until the foundations of one civilization became the invisible base of another. Only in the last few decades have excavations revealed staircases leading downward into chambers untouched since the day they were sealed. Far to the north, the city of Seattle offers a modern echo of the same pattern. After a devastating fire in 1889, the decision was made to raise the street level by several meters to prevent future flooding and improve sanitation. Instead of demolishing the older storefronts and walkways, the city simply built above them. Today, entire blocks of the original Seattle lie beneath the pavement, their brick walls and iron-framed doors preserved in the dark. Tourists descend into these corridors now, walking streets that once were filled with life, unaware that the city did not collapse but was deliberately elevated above itself. Edinburgh holds a similar secret. In the Old Town, alleyways known as closes were gradually sealed and overbuilt as the city expanded upwards. Whole sections of medieval streets disappeared beneath new architecture. For centuries, the older levels remained sealed, walled off from air and light, until chance rediscovery revealed long-forgotten rooms, stairwells, and living spaces. The silence in those chambers feels different from the silence of ancient ruins. It is a silence created by choice, by the slow accumulation of new stone over old. These examples show how easily a city can rise without announcing that it has done so. No catastrophe is required, no collapse. The layers simply build upon themselves as streets are leveled, as drainage improves, as new foundations replace old ones. Over time, the surface shifts upward, and the earlier city becomes a buried world that no one remembers walking through. When archaeologists encounter ancient sites with multiple layers of occupation stacked in clean, orderly sequences, the pattern mirrors what has happened in these modern cities. The older layers show no signs of violent end. They were not burned. They were not toppled. They were covered. And the people who lived above them may not have even realized they were climbing the shoulders of their own past. This understanding begins to unsettle the conventional idea of historical progression. It suggests that civilizations do not replace one another in the dramatic rhythm of rise and fall described in textbooks. Instead, they recurse. They fold, they repeat. They build above themselves again and again, leaving behind rooms, corridors, and streets that lie waiting beneath the surface, undisturbed until the earth is opened. But even this layering does not reveal the full depth of what lies below us. To truly understand the scale of the buried world, we must turn to the technologies that now allow us to see beneath the soil without disturbing it. And what these tools reveal is larger, wider, and far more intricate than any excavation alone can show. There was a time when the buried world could only be uncovered by the slow work of hands and tools, when the past revealed itself only through the narrow windows of trenches cut into the earth. But the ground has begun to open more willingly in recent decades, not because it has changed, but because the ways we see it have. Light, signal, and measurement now slip through soil, stone, jungle, and even concrete, revealing outlines of entire landscapes that had remained invisible for centuries. The first shock came from the jungles of Central America. For generations, archaeologists believed the Maya lived in scattered ceremonial centers surrounded by rural farmland. But when LiDAR scans swept across the canopy, the data stripped away vegetation like a curtain pulling back. Beneath the trees lay an engineered world, roads stretching for kilometers in straight lines, terraces carved across hillsides, reservoirs interconnected like organs in a living body, and more than 60,000 structures arranged with mathematical precision. Cities once thought isolated proved to be part of vast, connected networks, larger than anyone had imagined. The jungle had not destroyed them, it had preserved them. Ground-penetrating radar has performed similar acts of revelation in Europe. Beneath the streets of London, GPR surveys trace the outlines of long-forgotten roads that match the geometry of Roman occupation. Entire blocks emerged in the data, their walls and floors still in place beneath layers of later construction. Some of these features had never been recorded in any text or map. They existed only in the memory of the soil, waiting for a technology capable of reading it. In Egypt, satellite imagery has revealed buried chambers, foundations, and entire neighborhoods stretching beneath the desert sands. One of the most striking discoveries showed the ancient city of Tanis spreading far beyond its known boundaries, its streets and enclosures still intact under meters of wind-blown sediment. The desert had drawn a veil over the old world, but the signals from orbit could still trace its lines. Southeast Asia tells its own story. When LiDAR was directed across Cambodia, the results redrew the map of Angkor. What had been understood as a ceremonial complex was revealed instead as the heart of a vast urban landscape. Canals, dams, roads, and agricultural systems extended in every direction. The city was not merely a temple site, it was a megacity, perhaps the largest of its time, and most of it had been hidden beneath soil, rice fields, and vegetation that blended seamlessly with the land. The buried parts were not ruins, they were infrastructure, waiting beneath the surface, still shaping the flow of water and settlement even in the present day. Each new scan challenges the idea that we already know the boundaries of the ancient world. They show that our understanding is shaped not by what existed, but by what remained visible. The tools do not uncover artifacts, they uncover absence. They reveal how much of the past has slipped below the surface and how little of it has been examined. Yet even with these revelations, only a fraction of the Earth has been surveyed. Jungle regions remain largely unscanned. Deserts still conceal their oldest layers beneath dunes that shift unpredictably. Entire continents contain barely studied corridors of land where cities may lie beneath farmland, forest, or modern streets. If just a few targeted scans can expose networks of infrastructure on the scale of entire civilizations, the unanswered question grows heavier. How many worlds lie beneath the surface, still hidden in the places we have not yet looked? How many layers of humanity exist beneath our definitions of history, waiting for a moment when light or signal will finally unveil them? And if these technologies reveal so much with so little effort, what will they show when they are turned toward places already known for deep layers and long histories? The growing outline of hidden cities does more than expand maps. It forces a deeper reconsideration of time itself. It suggests that civilization does not grow along a smooth line, but gathers in vertical sequences, each layer sealed by earth, silence, or deliberate intent. The next step in understanding this pattern requires examining not just what lies hidden below, but what these discoveries imply about the true age and continuity of human settlement. If the ground holds more cities than we once believed, then the story of progress, collapse, and rebirth may be far more complicated than we imagine. And to follow that complication to its core, we must move to the next layer, where these revelations begin to challenge everything we think we know about the origins of civilization. Beneath cities that appear ancient, older layers of settlement lie sealed and forgotten. Beneath those, earlier occupations linger in traces that survive only where chance has preserved them. The more we find, the more the line of human history begins to fold into itself, turning into a series of surfaces that do not erase one another, but accumulate. Each one looks like a beginning only because the layers beneath it are silent. Archaeology has long struggled with this silence. A layer without objects is called a gap. A layer without writing is called prehistory. A layer without monumental architecture is called primitive. But these are names for absence, not insight. They reflect what we can see, not what once existed. When cities build over earlier cities, the older stories do not merely fade. They vanish under weight. No one destroys them intentionally. They simply fall out of reach. Yet the pattern of preserved infrastructure, sealed streets, intact chambers, and stacked foundations suggests something else. It suggests continuity, not rupture. A civilization does not need to disappear for its traces to slide beneath the surface. A change in climate, a shift in trade, a rise in ground level, or a new political authority can move a population slightly upward or slightly outward, leaving the old layer to sink quietly into memory. This raises an uncomfortable thought. What if many of the supposed collapses of the past were not collapses at all, but transitions that left earlier layers buried rather than destroyed? What if the civilizations we classify as separate were instead branches of the same long growth, each rising above the last until their roots disappeared from sight? Examples already challenge the linear story. In the Indus Valley, layers of occupation reveal gradual shifts rather than sudden ends. In the Near East, cities like Jericho contain so many stacked phases that their earliest layers vanish into depths unreachable without dismantling the upper ones. In the Americas, settlements grew, receded, and reappeared with the rhythm of climate, not conquest. Again and again, the archaeological record shows continuity hidden by sediment and time. Even in regions considered well understood, dating becomes more uncertain the deeper we go. Stone tools found beneath coastal sediments have pushed the timeline of human activity in some areas thousands of years earlier than expected. Submerged structures on continental shelves hint at settlements built when sea levels were far lower. The remains do not fit easily into the familiar progression. They suggest a world where human presence was older, more widespread, and more interrupted by environmental change than the simple staircase model allows. When the buried layers contradict the surface narrative, two interpretations emerge. One says that the anomalies are exceptions, artifacts of erosion, chance, or misinterpretation. The other says that our story of civilization has been assembled from pieces that survived by accident, while many other layers remain hidden, undiscovered, or inaccessible beneath fields, cities, and oceans. If the second interpretation holds even partially true, then the earliest chapters of human civilization may lie deeper than we can currently reach. They may be sealed beneath settlements that were themselves buried long ago, beyond the range of ordinary excavation. They may lie under coastlines swallowed by rising seas or beneath deserts that shifted over centuries. What we call the beginning of civilization may instead be the beginning of what is visible. This possibility becomes harder to dismiss as new discoveries continue to extend the timeline of human complexity backward. The question is no longer whether older layers exist, but how many there are, how deep they go, and how much of our understanding depends not on evidence, but on the lack of it. The buried layers of ancient cities might feel distant, belonging to times so far removed from our own that their rise and concealment seem like the natural cycles of forgotten worlds. But the pattern is not ancient. It is not even historical. It is happening now. In every major city on Earth, a new layer is forming beneath the surface of daily life, created not by disaster or abandon, but by the same quiet accumulation and upward movement that shape the past. Modern cities generate depth with remarkable speed. Subways run beneath the streets. Parking structures sink beneath office towers. Utility corridors branch like veins through the ground, carrying water, electricity, and data. When a building becomes outdated, it is not always demolished. It is capped, filled, or repurposed, leaving fragments of the old world sealed below the new one. In some cities, entire industrial districts lie buried under layers of concrete poured to support new developments. The people walking above have little sense of what remains beneath their feet. Waste adds its own layers. Landfills expand and harden into mounds that will persist for centuries. Layers of plastic, metal, and ash settle into the soil and mark the presence of our time with a signature no future era will mistake. What was once a place of disposal becomes, over generations, part of the landscape itself. And when those places are eventually reclaimed for parks, neighborhoods, or construction, the original surface disappears beneath engineered soil, becoming just one more stratum in the archive of the earth. Even climate adaptation produces burial. As sea levels rise, cities raise their streets, reinforce their coasts, and shift their ground upward. In some places, roads now sit higher than the first floors of older buildings. Drainage systems are extended over the rooftops of structures that once defined the horizon. New foundations rest atop older ones without removing them. If this continues, entire blocks of the modern world will someday lie below new surfaces, forgotten beneath the necessity of elevation. The most striking realization is how mundane this process feels. We do not imagine that future generations will walk above our buried cities, yet the same was true for the people of Rome, Paris, London, and countless others. They built what they needed and let older layers disappear from sight. They assumed the surface they stood on was the final one, the foundation that defined their world. The thought that their own homes and streets might one day become the lower levels of a deeper city would have seemed impossible. But the evidence collected from modern urban planning suggests exactly that. Centuries from now, excavators may find entire transportation networks intact beneath newer foundations. They may discover rooms filled with objects whose purpose is no longer clear. They may encounter corridors sealed off during construction, preserved simply because removing them was inconvenient. The buried world we are creating will puzzle them as deeply as the buried worlds of ancient times puzzle us. And just as we reinterpret the past through lenses shaped by our own culture, those future observers will reinterpret us. A data center might be seen as a temple. A ventilation shaft might be mistaken for a ceremonial tower. Layers of asphalt and concrete may be understood as symbols of order or ritual rather than practical infrastructure. Our world will become an archaeological riddle, its meaning shaped by the assumptions of those who inherit it. The cycle repeats itself with quiet inevitability. What is visible becomes normal. What is normal becomes assumed. What is assumed becomes unexamined. And what is unexamined sinks into the background until the ground itself rises and buries it. This realization forces us to look upward and downward at once. Upward toward the world we continue to build. Downward toward the worlds that lie beneath us. The separation between them is thinner than we imagine. The present is already becoming the past, settling into place as the next layer in a sequence that stretches far beyond written memory. But to understand what this means for the long arc of humanity, we must descend into the final layer, the one that turns all the buried worlds into a single continuous story and asks us to consider not only what lies below our cities, but what will one day lie above them. There will come a time when the cities we know today no longer define the horizon. The towers of steel and glass that seem immovable now will weather slowly, then suddenly, as storms carve their lines across the land and rivers alter their courses without asking permission. Streets will crack, foundations will shift, and the surface we walk on with such certainty will begin to fold itself into the quieter rhythms of the earth. Centuries will pass, and the ground will take our world into itself, just as it took the worlds that came before. Long after our names have scattered into forgotten languages, someone else will walk across the reshaped landscape. They will see only what remains, and what remains will not be the familiar outlines of our time. Instead, it will be a thin compressed layer of unfamiliar materials, reinforced structures sealed inside soil that has tightened around them. They may find fragments of our ambitions embedded in the earth, concrete platforms, broken glass, rusted steel, and objects once so ordinary that we never imagined they would outlast the stories we told about ourselves. Future explorers may break through a slab of collapsed roadway and enter rooms still holding the quiet shape of our lives. A staircase that leads into darkness, a corridor sealed by a wall that was never meant for archaeology, a collection of small objects left exactly where they were forgotten. They will lift these items with the same mix of curiosity and uncertainty we feel when we touch the tools of civilizations that vanished long before our own. And they will wonder who we were. Some of their conclusions will be wrong. They may interpret our infrastructure as temples, our utility lines as ritual pathways, our discarded waste as sacred offerings. They may search for meaning in things that never carried any and overlook the values we hoped would define us. This misreading will not be their failure. It will be the natural consequence of distance, the same distance that keeps us from fully understanding the intentions behind the stone carvings, roads, and chambers buried deep beneath our feet. The layers beneath their own cities will whisper the same truths we uncovered as we journeyed downward. Layers shaped by human hands, layers shaped by nature, layers shaped by forgetting. And as they compare their lives to the ones sealed under their streets, they will realize something that echoes across every discovery. The people of the past rarely knew they were becoming the past. They lived as we do now, believing their moment was solid and enduring, unaware that time was quietly preparing to place another layer above them. This recognition carries a lesson. The layers that form the human story are not simply records of architecture or culture. They are reminders of how fragile permanence is. Each layer holds a world that once believed it understood its place in time, a world that may have imagined it stood at the height of progress. Yet each was eventually folded into the earth and left to be rediscovered by people who no longer shared its memories or fears or aspirations. We are part of that same sequence. Our buildings, our inventions, our failures, and our dreams will become part of the archive future hands uncover. The value of what we build will be measured not by how long it stands, but by whether it leaves something worth understanding. The lesson hidden in the buried cities is not a warning of collapse. It is a reminder of continuity. Civilizations rise, falter, adapt, and rise again, not in a straight line but in overlapping layers, each one shaped by the choices made above and below it. One day, someone standing where we once stood will brush soil from the remnants of our world and wonder how many layers supported the life they know. They may marvel at our accomplishments or puzzle over our contradictions. They may judge us, admire us, or misunderstand us entirely. But they will know one thing with certainty. We were not the beginning, and we will not be the end. The buried worlds beneath our feet reveal that humanity is not a single ascent. It is a long dialogue across time, spoken in stone, soil, and silence. We stand on the highest rung only briefly. The ground beneath us is already shifting, already rising, already preparing to fold our moment into the deeper record. And before we close this journey, if you found meaning or wonder in these hidden layers of our world, feel free to like the video, share it with someone who enjoys mysteries, and subscribe so you do not miss the next descent into the unknown. And if you are listening late into the night, I hope these thoughts stay with you gently. Sleep well, and thank you for being here. And when future generations finally uncover the traces of who we were, they may understand what we are only beginning to grasp. Our lives, our monuments, even our greatest achievements were never resting on solid ground. They were resting on a surface shaped by countless forgotten worlds. And everything we build, everything we cherish, is destined to become another layer in the quiet and enduring stack of human time,